You ever have one tiny thing, one red mark, one sneer, one sentence, land in your life and everything else starts to tilt? That's where this begins. Picture a quiet classroom in a place that thinks it's too fancy to have problems. A girl standing up to tell a simple truth, and getting labeled a liar with a single swipe. That moment changes everything, and yeah, it's ugly. But it's also the first crack in a wall that should have come down years ago. Act 1. The hook, the red pen, and the rumor. My name in this town is Maya Rivera. I'm 16, glasses loud. Laugh when I'm not trying to disappear. I grew up in a house where my mom, Captain Lena Ortiz, taught me to pack my own lunches and to never, ever let anyone take my story away. She's the kind of woman who can walk into a room and the air straightens not because she wants attention, but because she's earned it in places most people won't go. But at Westfield Academy, her name sounded like fiction, a story too big for a girl like me to claim. One Monday morning, our history teacher, Mrs. Langford, asked us to write about a hero in our family. I stood up and said what I always said at home. Voice steady. My mom is in the Navy's Special Warfare Unit. She's been to dangerous places. She's the reason strangers get to sleep safe at night. Laughter like a wave hit the room, and Tyler Grayson, star athlete class golden boy, led the chorus, calling it a fantasy. The teacher didn't defend me, she performed. She snatched my essay, flipped to the title I'd written big on purpose, Hero, and with a swift red line wrote Liar above it. Not a discussion, not a question. A verdict. She held it up like evidence and said, plain as daylight, "We value truth here." The class cheered. I sat down, with my hands shaking my face, hot, the word burning like acid across the page. You ever feel the whole floor drop beneath you? That was that moment. Humiliation is a strange, heavy thing. It sits on your shoulders and makes the room smaller until you forget how to be anything else. Act 2. The struggle and the turning point. From mockery to exposure. After that, things escalated. Kids who hadn't known my name suddenly had a chorus for it. Liar became a chant. Tyler pushed me in the lunch line. Friends filmed everything with bright little screens, and someone tossed my mom's challenge coin, a small bronze thing with an anchor and years of sweat in its dents, into the recycling bin like trash. I pulled it out with hands that smelled of ketchup and defeat, but holding it felt like holding a proof that I hadn't invented my life. So I did what a lot of kids do when the adults fail them. I tried to stand alone. I went to Mrs. Langford after class, voice quiet but fixed, and asked her to look at my mom's photo, to look at the coin. She barely glanced, then told me to grow up to stop making trouble. "You don't belong to this story," she said, which oddly is the meanest part, when a person with power decides your truth isn't theirs to hold. And then the real violence showed up. She kicked me, yeah, right there in a classroom that had rules about behavior and dignity. And I crumpled against the doorway, clutching my side, every breath a hot pinprick. It was raw, sudden, grotesquely adult. For a second, I floated outside my body and watched it happen the way you watch a train wreck on TV, helpless and angry and numb all at once. If any of that sounds like the end, it isn't. Because in that exact moment, the sky made a sound. A low, mechanical thunder. Helicopter blades carved the air, and a woman in a uniform stepped out like she belonged to storms. Captain Lena Ortiz. Not loud, not performative, just sharp and fierce. She walked across the field with 2 Navy sailors at her side and found me on the floor like she had been tracking the world for me all along. She looked at Mrs. Langford the way a commander looks at an enemy who can't hide behind paperwork and said quietly, "Who hurt my daughter?" That question landed like a gavel. Power has a smell, and sometimes you only recognize it when it's pointed at you. But power in a place like Westfield wasn't just a uniform. It was slots on boards, donations, parents who made the town's calendar spin. Principal Baxter and the PTA were a well-oiled machine that protected their own, and they didn't want a scandal. Our cameras were offline. Baxter told Lena, and it sounded like an excuse a man used when he didn't want to complicate his life. Backups failed. Convenient right cameras that conveniently didn't work are how small injustices become big lies. Because without footage, your word is less than theirs. Here's where the story gets cinematic, except it's not a movie, it's a life. Mr. Howard, the janitor, the man who moves through the building with a cart and a soft hat. He's the kind of person nobody thinks to thank. He had a little camera tucked in a corner because once someone tried to blame him for a missing purse, so he learned to keep watch. He handed Lena a tiny SD card, the sort that people don't notice unless they need proof. "I see things," he said, shrugging like it's nothing, but he knew the whole time what justice looks like when no one else is watching. The footage was blunt and terrible. The shove, the kick, the way I hit the floor. Mrs. Langford's face when she knew she couldn't hide from the pixels. It was evidence raw and undeniable. Once video exists, words have to do less work. The scene shifted from gossip to investigation, from whispered rumors to legal papers. Then came the second shock. Mrs. Langford's family secrets. Not mine, hers. Captain Lena, who'd once had to defend people in the field, had a file on Mrs. Langford's son, a soldier who'd been removed from duty for conduct unbecoming for racism in a unit that couldn't afford it. The woman who had been shouting about truth now saw the past she'd tried to bury rise like smoke. The town that had kept her comfortable suddenly had no use for her excuses. And Tyler, the golden boy. He panicked at first because the world he'd been taught to inhabit, where his name meant cover and influence meant immunity, was tilting. Then something shifted inside him. In a packed auditorium with PTA moms clutching pearls and the press alive with microphones, he did something nobody expected. He stood up, took the microphone and said, messy and shaking and real, "I started the rumor. I filmed it. I thought it was funny. It was like a hand being extended from a ship that's about to sink. An admission that pulled the truth out into the light." Act 3. The Reckoning and the Aftermath. Justice, fragile and complicated. What followed wasn't a neat ending, because endings are rarer in real life. Mrs. Langford was suspended, investigations opened, and the school's board found records that looked like math and charity but were actually theft. Grants, rerouted scholarships quietly shifted to children with the right last names. Principal Baxter's breath smelled like paperwork and regret as subpoenas arrived. Councilman Grayson, Tyler's father, found himself under federal scrutiny, the very man who said he'd protect the town, now watching the ground he'd built his power on crumble. The beautiful small thing in all of that uproar was the people who'd been quiet. Mr. Howard received a plaque in the auditorium for doing the honest thing, and my essay, the one they'd tried to erase, was read in a classroom where the new teacher promised to listen. Tyler, not yet reformed, but bending, offered an apology that didn't fix years, but it was something like the first step. There are bruises that heal and comics that don't. I still have the scar on my ribs and the memory of the shoe like a punctuation mark in that scene. But the school is different now. Not perfect, never perfect, because institutions change slowly. But different enough that when someone tries to write liar on a page, a few more hands reach to tear it out. Here's the part that keeps people arguing justice came, but it came because a bunch of imperfect people chose to make it come. A janitor who kept a camera, a kid who decided to be honest, a mother who refused to let silence be the law. They were the unlikely coalition that toppled an old order. Some will say it was a spectacle, others will say it was overdue. Both are true. Systems that shelter privilege don't crumble by hashtags alone. They fall when enough people, small and large, make the day uncomfortable for those who profit from silence. Final beat. The open question and the call to action. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a school that still has to rebuild trust, with students who have to learn what accountability looks like, and with me, Maya, sat at my desk, pen in hand, feeling a little lighter, but also knowing the work that remains. The story isn't over. It never is. But it's different now because people saw what a red pen could do and chose not to let it win. Now, I want to hear from you. What would you do if you saw someone being torn down and the people in charge looked the other way? Have you ever had to choose between keeping quiet and making a scene? Tell us in the comments. Be honest, be messy, be brave. If this moved you, share it, like and subscribe for more stories about people who refuse to let silence be the default. And if you've been on the receiving end of something like this, write it down below. Your voice matters, and sometimes one voice starts a chorus that topples towers.